World War II started in Europe on September 1st, 1939, with Germany's invasion of Poland. Though it would be 2 more years before they would enter the war, the United States supplied their European allies with armaments and food. Washington called for an increase in war production across the country. In 1939, the state of Connecticut opened its first training program for industrial workers. Governor Raymond E. Baldwin called the United States the arsenal of democracy, and Connecticut the arsenal of the nation. By the end of the war, Connecticut industry employed approximately 550,000 war workers. Of these, 147,800 were women. And of these, Jewish women played a significant role in the new home front workforce.
It was a very busy time. They were working 7 days a week, and some of them were working around the clock, like 3 shifts. The ladies came out of the house from working. You know, Rosie the Riveter was probably born during those years, because women went to work for the war effort.
Our story begins in the Jewish communities of Connecticut's capital city, Hartford. By the mid-19th century, Hartford was home to approximately 200 Jews who settled on the city's east side. They were part of a larger wave of immigration from Germany. Between 1881 and the late 1920s, an estimated 3.6 million Jews left their homes in Eastern Europe and immigrated to the United States. The Jewish community spread from the east into the north end of Hartford, which became a vibrant Jewish area. They worked in a variety of businesses and trades and established synagogues, formed fraternal and charitable groups, and became active in Hartford's civic life. By the 1920s, Jews made up an estimated 10% of the total population of 18,000 in Hartford. When the Depression hit Hartford in the early 1930s, life became increasingly difficult as many men and women lost their jobs. The efforts to support the Allies in World War II gave an enormous boost to the local economy. We asked Phyllis Lappin what she knew about women's work before the war.
I think, I would say not half, but a good proportion of women of my age at that time maybe went to secretarial schools. I really should have gone to college because I was an excellent student. I graduated number 6 in the class, and it was many, I think there were 400 and something in the class. But my parents had struggled, you know, during the Depression, and I felt that I wanted to go out and help. I wanted to be on my own. I lived at home, but I didn't want to have to ask them for anything. And college, even as inexpensive as it was still money.
And what other types of office jobs are there?
Well, suppose we see if we can find the answers to your question.
I graduated from high school in 1937, and there was a change beginning then. The big employers were the insurance companies, and that was the first year that a Jewish woman was hired to work. At that time, if you were a teacher, you couldn't be married. Once you were married, you couldn't teach. This was all part of my era.
When I first went into the workforce, I went into the telephone company, and I was the first Jewish girl that became an operator. I couldn't believe that with all the hundreds of people that worked there. And then another one came in. Same thing at Colts. I went to work, I was the first Jewish girl in the office. But then eventually they had more Jewish girls. They didn't say they weren't hiring them, but they didn't.
I was the only Jewish girl many of the nursing students had ever seen, and I was the only Jewish girl in the nursing school.
When I was married, he didn't think of wanting me to go back to work. I wanted to work. And I felt that I wanted to be productive, I wanted to be useful. And he said no. But then when the war came along, people were in the factories.
Everything changed with the war.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii by air, President Roosevelt has just announced.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
I was pregnant and we went to the movies. And as we went into the movies, we heard the radio say that Pearl Harbor was attacked. I had never even heard of Pearl Harbor. And then, of course, we heard about it. Somebody came out on the stage of the theater in Willimantic and announced that we were at war. And I suddenly became very frightened because I know what war means.
I remember a great excitement and a greater disbelief in anybody that this was actually happening. And we all knew that we were going to have to be somewhere doing something.
You don't know what's going to happen. You're living in midair suddenly because you know that things are going to begin to happen.
I was getting ready to go out on a date.
Okay. And what happened?
We went. The three guys that went. If you ask me who they were, I can't remember. Three couples, we went. The next day, they all three enlisted.
Millions volunteered or were drafted into the armed forces. In Connecticut alone, more than 200,000 men and 3,300 women served during the course of the war. Women enlisted in all branches of the military. Approximately 150,000 joined the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, with 12 Jewish women graduating from the first WAC officer training class in 1942. An additional 60,000 women volunteered for the Army Nurse Corps.
And we started to march, not walk. We were hop, 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 all the way up some big hill into Hunter College, and we were in the service, and there was no doubt about it. We were not our individuals anymore, and it was you had to get used to it. It was quite a change.
I was doing nursing. I had graduated from nursing school, and I was doing nursing at one of the local hospitals. And the war broke. We began to hear what was happening to the Jews. And so when the war broke out, I think all the Jewish nurses that were available signed up.
I had been away at school for 4 years at college, and I came home, and it was kind of what I thought boring in Hartford. And I went out for lunch one day from where I was working at the state on Main Street, the State Department, on Health Department on Main Street. And I went out for lunch one day and saw a big poster in front of the post office that said, "We want you in the Navy." And I walked up and went in and talked to the girl, had an interview, and began thinking about it.
This was not foreign to me because of growing up with my dad's involvement with the Jewish war veterans. It was really in my blood. And when the war started in, I said, "I bet you feel badly that you didn't have a son so he could go into the Army." So I said, "Okay." I said, I'll be the son," and that's when we joked about it. And I said, "And I'll go into the United States Nurse Cadet Corps." So I had a uniform. So I said, "Now does that make you happy?" So it made him happy that I was doing something for our country.
My mother was proud. She was, of course, she was always concerned, but she was proud of the fact that I was doing my bit. And we all wanted to do our bit. The whole country was united then behind President Roosevelt. and everybody felt we wanted to do our thing for the war effort.
Basic training took place at Fort Devens, which was a basic training for all soldiers. Not, I mean, there are others in the country, but the one in the Northeast for basic training was Fort Devens in Massachusetts.
You know, all day long for months, you know, you marched, you hiked, you had gas mask drill, we went on 15-mile hikes, we did the infiltration course, which was crawling on your belly under live ammunition. We had classes, we learned everything from Yaws to Tsutsugamuchi fever. We didn't know what theater of operation we would be going to, so we had to learn all the tropical diseases.
You had to get up early in the morning, and you were out marching in bitter cold weather. It was January, bitter cold weather, windy cold weather in the morning. And they had us doing all kinds of exercises and things as though we were going off to war to fight. We were hysterical laughing. You had to have a sense of humor. And it was rough days, but another gal and myself, another Jewish girl and myself, discovered they had a area where you could play ping pong and have fun. We went over there, even though our bodies ached from top to bottom from marching and doing everything. If you had a sense of humor, you could live through it.
You learned all the protocol of the Navy, and you learned to march, and you learned to pass, hopefully on Saturday, to pass inspection. And that was very important. So we learned a lot about health and hygiene and of our skills.
They didn't know what we were going to be doing. People were going, I was going to go into a lab work, I hoped. Other girls were going to different things, and they were just training you in general. You had to learn what the airplanes looked like. You had to learn what kind of different boats looked like, the ships looked like. I don't know why, but that's what they did. They trained us as though we were going off to sea.
Although women did not serve in combat units, they filled the support jobs, releasing men for service on the battlefield. Many women simply continued the profession that they trained for as civilians. Julie Green, a professional court reporter, spent hours a day typing work orders for soldiers. Shirley Cohen worked in a lab, and Phyllis Lappin nursed sick and wounded soldiers, some returning with harrowing accounts of the fighting overseas.
I was typing orders for a lot of the submariners, but I never told anybody. And I was a top-notch reporter. And it was a busy time, busy place. And I wasn't the only one typing orders. There's 3 shifts, and other women were typing orders at different hours.
Sent to National Naval Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland. And I was in the lab there, and we were assigned to a barracks, and we lived there. And then this was, now you were doing your work. The same thing I did in civilian life now I was doing in the Navy, but under the rules and regulations of the Navy.
It was a very sobering experience, and you just grew up very quickly. And you couldn't believe that incidents like they related could have even occurred.
Military service drained the Connecticut workforce, opening thousands of jobs to women. Not only did women move into the war plants, which manufactured airplanes, ships, communications equipment, and guns, but they also took jobs previously held by men, such as bank tellers and salespeople.
I replaced a man who went to war. I worked for the Boy Scouts of America at 2 Park Avenue, and I was called the Director of Relationships.
I went to, became the secretary to the Assistant Superintendent of Schools in Hartford. It was a wonderful position. I had a wonderful time doing it.
I worked in the Navy Department, but at that time women went to what everybody kids me. I was Rosie the Riveter, but I was not. I was in an office. But let me tell you, when we walked through the floor of the factory, the men used to whistle. They were not used to seeing women around there. But if, you know, in the smaller factories, not in the engine factories, women were working in the factories.
There weren't very many nurses. I think 2 nurses for a whole floor. How could they do everything? So people like me would go in, we would make beds, we would help, we learned how to wash people, give them bed baths, and that you're helping the nurses. So I felt that that was something that was important.
We used to go in on weekends, and we would feed we'd deliver food, we'd feed the patients, and talk to them.
I was an air raid warden when I lived on Westland Street. You went out and looked around, made sure all the lights were off.
What we want to do is to educate the public to protect themselves in the event of a foreign attack, to train the necessary number of civilians in the work of air raid wardens and an auxiliary fire force to meet any emergency.
You actually knew that there was a war going. There were blackouts. There were the men who were at home, were on watch. They had watches where they, patrol the streets at night.
We were told to pull our shades down. You must understand, we were an hour from the submarine base, and there was talk of Germans coming in that area to blow up Groton, the submarine base.
Was it frightening?
Absolutely frightening. Then we said to ourselves, why are we bringing children into this world? What are we doing here? We're perpetuating children, but we don't know what kind of a life they're going to have. That's the thoughts that came to us young women.
But there is one front and one battle where everyone in the United States, every man, woman, and child, is in action and will be privileged to remain in action throughout this war. That front is right here at home, in our daily lives, in our daily tasks. Here at home, everyone will have the privilege of making whatever self-denial is necessary, not only to supply our fighting men, but to keep the economic structure of our country fortified and secure during the war and after the war.
The war affected every aspect of daily life. Rationing began almost immediately. Everyone had a ration book, which allowed for the purchase of specified amounts of rationed goods. This was followed by limits on cars, bicycles, other items made of metal, and food of all sorts. Fats and oils were used for the production of munitions. Surplus food went to soldiers and to civilians in the war zones. Women like Gloria learned to recycle and to cook and preserve whatever they could buy with their ration coupons or grow in their victory gardens.
The University of Connecticut taught us how to have a garden. Everybody had a garden so that you could plant vegetables, and whatever you did was for the war effort. You always had that in mind. That was the most important thing in your mind.
You want a new refrigerator, Mom. That's 140 pounds of steel.
2 million Americans bought refrigerators last year. Today they've got to do without. That was enough steel for 20,000 light tanks, for 66,000 anti-aircraft guns, for the hulls of 21 cruisers to sink the Japs.
Today, children are watching TV, they're playing with their computers. In those days, they ran around looking for metal because they were working for the war. They took such pride in helping in the community activities. They were working, they went around looking in all the backyards and the junkyards, looking for pieces of metal. And when it came all together, it went into a depot. We had an armory down the street, and they collected everything, and it went into the war effort.
Oh, we collected tin foil and made balls of tin foil. And you saved war stamps and bought war bonds. That was very, very important. We started knitting thumbless mittens for aviators, for British aviators. So I do remember doing that, the things that kids could do. I mean, I was 12 or 13.
Nutrition programs instead of recipe swapping. But the impulse is the same. The tradition is the same.
Tickets for a pound of butter. That's all you could get for a pound, and it was supposed to last a month or so. They taught us how to balance our meals and how to make combination dishes where you could get nourishing meals and use your vegetables and your starches all in one. So you're saving on a pot. You're using only one burner on the oven. And then we made our own mayonnaise. We made our own, some people made their own ice cream, I remember. They had a base in Norwich, which was 25 minutes away from Groton submarine base. And we were taken by a bus. The Armory gave us one of their Army buses. We were with soldiers, and we went there to dance with them in Norwich, I remember.
And your husband didn't care?
Well, we were doing it for the war effort. I wasn't going there for other reasons. We were just going to make some boys happy. And they were lonely away from home. So he understood that. And there was never any question.
They had dances to Bradley Field every other Monday. I wore a sweater with a skirt. They didn't wear pants in those days.
Were they cute guys?
Yeah, they were cute. Lynn and I liked the same guy.
And what happened?
Well, then he got shipped out. And they were good dancers, and we loved to dance. Swing and sway, you know what they did in those days, jitterbug. I loved dancing. It was fun.
In 1942, my husband enlisted in, he was a dentist, he enlisted in the Physicians Health Service, which was attached to the United States Coast Guard. And in 1943, he left the country and went to Greenland and spent the war living on a glacier in a Quonset hut.
I'm joining.
When, Johnny?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow.
Mary, you're not mad, are you? Hey, wait a minute. This isn't our stop.
Yes, it is. City Hall. Come on.
City Hall?
Well, if you're joining up tomorrow, we're getting married today.
Mary?
Joan and I decided that we wanted to get married. And his mother said, oh, please wait till you're home and everyone can be there. No, we were determined because I just knew he was going to have to go overseas eventually. Anyway, we were married. We had a chaplain, Berkowitz, married us, and in the chapel there at the field. And then we went out to dinner. And then I think he had to go, I think he had one night that he stayed with me, and then he had to go back to the field. When he left, I saw him leave, and that was very traumatic. And it was, when you see that, oh, I'll start to cry if I talk about it too much. It was very sad.
Women were busy on the Connecticut home front, working, volunteering, and saying goodbye to loved ones who were going overseas to work or fight. Yet some were also aware that in Europe, Jews were being persecuted. The Nazis' treatment of the Jews in Germany had convinced some Americans to lobby Washington to increase the immigration quotas for Jewish refugees. And in the late 1930s, Hartford families succeeded in bringing a small number of relatives from Germany. But by the 40s, immigration had stopped, and lines of communication started to break down between American Jews and their European friends and relatives. Information was vague, and news was scarce.
I think without all the TV and all the news media and the rapid dissemination of news so fast, we didn't know exactly what was going on. Like I said, when we were there, we didn't keep up with the war. We didn't know what was going on. I had met, in college, I had already met a gal from Germany who came over here and couldn't get her, waited for her mother to come. All the time she was there, she graduated my class with me. And she was waiting for her mother to get over. Her mother never made it over here, but she managed to get her over. And she was taken in by a family. But in the service, I didn't run into anything like that. I was not aware of anything that was going on. We didn't keep up with the news at all when I re-look back.
We heard rumblings because Hitler started in '33. We heard rumblings and our relatives were there and letters began to stop. So we knew something was going on, but never did we ever think of the crematoria or the other things that were happening in the concentration camps. Never occurred to us. We never heard of it.
I think that innocence is its own protection sometimes. So some of the really horrible implications of what Hitler was doing, and I read Mein Kampf too, parts of it, and I think that was out when I was very young. But it was so absurd to me. It was so far from my experience that I didn't even have questions to ask. You know, you get protected.
People here could try to find out what was happening to their loved ones in Europe. And I learned Polish, and I was able to write brochures and leaflets and flyers that were dropped by airplanes over Poland, bearing the names and addresses of people here and the names and addresses of people they were looking for. And we had success.
Was this right after the war?
No, it was during the war. Oh, during the war.
While Julie, Shirley, and Phyllis worked in military jobs stateside, the need for nurses in the European theater was enormous, and Army nurses Muriel and Sarah applied for overseas service. Muriel's unit landed on Utah Beach, where they saw the remnants of the D-Day battle.
We were in a huge convoy of ships. There were perhaps 60 to 70 ships in this convoy. They were just spread out across the Atlantic as far as you could see. And what should have been a 5-day trip turned out to be a 12-day trip because we had to dodge German U-boats and submarines. And then there were huge winter storms that washed over the decks.
I was a little hospital. I was an evacuation hospital. It was a small unit. We followed the tanks and we followed the infantry. And even being small, we had 4 Jewish nurses. I think actual bed cots, you know, for tents, I think we could handle about 400.
Muriel's group was assigned to Liège, a large industrial and railway center in Belgium, where their task was to set up a new 1,000-bed mobile tent hospital. At first, they were relatively safe behind the lines. Then came the buzz bombs and the Battle of the Bulge.
A general hospital is usually 100 miles or more behind the fighting lines. But this experiment, they wanted to put a tented general hospital as close to the front lines as possible using the triage system. And they never told us that at some point we were going to be ahead of the lines.
Buzz bombs, also called doodlebugs, and V-1 or V-2 rockets were robot bombs. The Germans launched the first ones against England in June 1944, killing civilians and destroying property. With their characteristic putt-putt sound, the buzz bombs flew over their target, suddenly stopped, and fell to the ground, demolishing everything beneath them.
But we were scared, we really were. But my patients, they were so wonderful that they were so worried about, they were angry that American nurses were so far up front. One patient made a blackjack for me. This blackjack was a 10-inch length of hose that was stuffed with lead sinkers and suspended from my wrist by a leather thong. And he said if a kraut comes near you, you just slam it across his eyes.
The week before Christmas, 1944, the skies above Liège had been clouded over by a thick fog. Allied planes were unable to take off in those conditions, but German buzz bombs continued to fall. On Christmas Eve, the fog finally lifted, and a German plane carried out a deadly attack on Muriel's hospital.
And I was on night duty in the surgical tent, and it was about 8 o'clock, and I heard the sound of a plane overhead. And I knew from the sound of the motor it was not one of ours. And I stepped outside to take a look. And while I watched, the plane that had dropped these flares started flying back and forth across our hospital tents, strafing the tents and dropping anti-personnel bombs. And I ran back into my tent, and my patients were already strapping on, excuse me, their steel helmets, and I said, "Get under your bed." And I found an empty bed. And fortunately, all my patients were ambulatory because the sickest ones had been shipped out earlier that day. And I found an empty bed, and I scrambled under it too. And I let out a yell, and my ward man, who was at the other end of the tent, yelled out, "Lieutenant, have you been hit?" And I yelled back very disgustedly, "No, only by a loaded duck." And in hospital lingo, a loaded duck was a full urinal. My patients laughed wildly at this, and it was great because it helped dispel some of the fear and the tension that we had all felt a few minutes before. Well, this plane came back every hour on the hour, all night long. And they finally shot him down a few miles away early the next morning. Many of our patients were killed, and hospital staff were killed or injured that night. And our entire day crew came back on duty to help out in the operating room and on the wards wherever needed. It was a night we'll never forget.
In addition to being afraid for their own lives and the lives of their patients, nurses stationed overseas were expected to be as tough as the men when it came to living conditions in the field.
Oh, I would get up about 6:37 in the morning, have my powdered eggs, which I loved. I didn't dare tell anyone because I was so hungry, and toast, not toast, white bread and coffee. And we were treated just like the soldiers we had. We slept on cots without sheets, and or on the ground when we had to.
You tried to stay clean. We were only allowed one canteen of water a day. The first few weeks, the water truck would come by and it'd fill this big Lister bag, and so you were able to drink, have your one canteen for drinking, for washing yourself, and for washing clothes. I'd say it held about a pint.
How could you wash your clothes in a pint of
Well,
water?
You couldn't do an awful lot. A pint was about, the canteens weren't any larger than this.
But I was in fatigues all the time, and all we had was a helmet to wash. Towards the end, I have a picture. We were given a pail, a height of luxury. The whole tent, 5 of us, were given one pail, but that was the height of luxury.
And of course, we had been living in these olive drab combat pants and olive drab combat liners and olive drab long underwear and olive drab, everything olive drab. And, wearing helmets on your head and combat boots. You felt grungy. You never felt feminine.
Mary! A letter from Johnny!
The mail that came from overseas that anyone got was the little blue air things, and everything was censored. I mean, it was either blacked out or cut out or anything. Had no idea.
It's maybe 2 inches by maybe 3 inches, tiny, tiny little print. It's a wonder you could even read it. I mean, you almost needed a magnifying glass to read it because it had to be so small if they wanted to get a lot on that little page.
You waited for weeks. Sometimes mail got held up. But then when mail bags came in, it was the greatest morale raiser in the world. And packages from home, I'm just embarrassed when I read my letters that I sent home were saved by my mother, because I was always saying, "Mom, please send me this, please send me that."
I used to write to a lot of soldiers. I told you I sent that picture all over. I used to write to a lot of soldiers, funny letters, what everybody was doing, how everybody looked, what's going on, movie we saw. I think of something to say.
He could tell me that he was fine and that he was out and played cards with the guys, and he couldn't tell me anything.
In addition to their fear of enemy attacks, Americans worried about their family members in the armed forces. Particularly frightening was the arrival of a Western Union messenger with a telegram, often a sign of bad news from the War Department.
Well, when the news kept coming in that soldiers were dying, it was very sad. There was special service, at the synagogue. And it was sad, very sad. People you knew and went to school with got killed. His name was Louis Pessin. We used to say, what is Louis going to be? The governor? We had all these things that what he might be because he was so special. Besides being tall and good-looking, in personality, in brains, and everything rolled into one, I thought to myself, and not I alone, everyone thought, oh my God, what is he going to come back and be? He got killed.
On May 8, 1945, the Allies accepted Germany's unconditional surrender. Muriel and Sarah began to prepare for their transfer home.
I was glad it was over and the killing was done. VE Day, there was such a sense of euphoria. We went into one of the officers' clubs. You danced and you drank, and by that, we just had a ball. We knew it was coming. The last couple of weeks we knew that the end was near. And finally we left, I guess in mid-November, and we got home about the week before Thanksgiving.
And then I found out that my cousin who was an Israeli, was in the Jewish Brigade. And so when the war ended, we were in Germany, I asked for permission if I can go to Brussels and find him. And I did. I found the Jewish Community Center in Brussels. I found the Rabbi Casper of the Israeli army, and we went to Antwerp. And I walked into the hangar. The brigade was in a hangar, and I walked in. He didn't expect me. And I took a look at the Jewish Brigade men, and I saw my cousin immediately. He came towards me. I came towards him. And they said, take a leave. They told him to leave. We spent a few days together.
Well, this is a telegram that I received from him. Let's see, what's the date on here? December 19th, 1945. It's from Long Beach, California. And Mrs. Julian Adler, 890 Farmington Avenue. Arrive safely. Expect to see you soon. Don't attempt to contact or write me here. Love, Julian.
The end of the war meant that thousands of soldiers and military personnel, both male and female, returned home. Soldiers were expected to return to civilian life, and women who had filled jobs held by soldiers before the war were required to relinquish them when the men returned. The attitude toward women reverted to the traditional view of women as mothers and homemakers. But the seeds had been sown, and women who had seen themselves as competent and talented workers paved the way for the changes that would revolutionize women's roles in the 20th century. But for now, women like Muriel and Sarah were happy to be returning home, full of stories and hopeful for the future.
People said, when you were so worried about the buzz bombs and the Germans, did you cry? We didn't cry. You didn't cry at all over there. But the day we sailed past that Statue of Liberty, there wasn't a dry eye on that ship. It was the most beautiful sight in the world, coming home.
pursue me, I'm never gloomy, I keep on singing a song. Though the clouds hang low, I laugh and roll, and go rolling along. No need to hurry, no need to worry, that things are gonna go wrong. Like the birds that sing, I dream of spring as I'm rolling along. Give me the moon for a blanket, give me the stars overhead, and I'll make the mountain my doorstep.